probably start on page 1. Every year I come to GDC, I play a little game called Who's Corporate and Who's Indie? Wait a minute, what happened there? There we go. Who's holding down a full-time job with benefits, wearing a logo shirt and staying at the W on the company dime, versus who's an independent contractor schmoozing for that next gig, staying at the Mosser if they're lucky. But more importantly, what were they last year? More than with other game development and technology disciplines, seems like audio folks tend to spend their careers going back and forth between holding down corporate gigs and freelancing from backroom project studios. There are certainly some who have always had jobs and others who have never produced audio except under contract. But if you work long enough in this industry, odds are you will eventually transition from one state to the other. Now, that's certainly been true in my case. In 1997, I went to my first GDC in San Jose as an indie, green and desperate. 5 years later, I showed up at GDC 2002, proudly wearing a Danger logo shirt, where I began my career as a mobile audio guy. Later, I got assimilated by Microsoft right before GDC 2008, but was back to being indie for GDC 2010. I moved back to the Bay Area from Redmond in time for GDC 2013 and interviewed for an audio engineering job at Kixeye during the conference. In 2015, I attended the show as an indie again, wearing a flash leather jacket and with a pocket full of Twittering machine business cards in full schmoozin' for work mode. And the first guy I ran into when I got off the BART was George the Fat Man Sanger. I said, "Hey George, how you doing?" He looks at me and goes, "Drescher, I got a job for you." And that was that. A few months later, I'm living in lovely Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and attended GDC 2016 and 17 as senior audio engineer at Magic Leap, the world's most enigmatic unicorn. And now, here I am again, right back where I started from, living in California, working as an independent contractor from my backroom studio, and kind of loving it. So, to discuss the pros and cons of working freelance versus holding down a job, I am lucky to be joined on stage by 4 distinguished colleagues who have also worked both sides of the equation. In alphabetical order, Damian Kastbauer, currently at ArenaNet, formerly at PopCap, plus many independent projects, including the Oscar-winning Carne y Arenas. Wilbert Roget, award-winning composer for Call of Duty World War II, Lara Croft, and numerous LucasArts titles. Caron Weidner, president and founder of 8-Ball Sound in Los Angeles, formerly at GameTrax and Sound Deluxe. Guy Whitmore, currently independent, formerly at PopCap and Microsoft Game Studios. And of course, you can call your humble moderator PDX. So, we'll now discuss 5 topics for 8 minutes each, and then do Q&A. So, the first topic, well, there's the topics. Art. How does being corporate or indie help or hinder the creative process when producing a game soundtrack? Now, for me, this kind of, one of the things I always do is I always maintain my own home studio, because I find being creative in outside of the corporate environment where there's meetings and people running around, blah, 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 and you can't really be as free as you might like. So if I'm doing a piece of music, I always try and write in my home studio and then bring it into the corporate studio to implement and test. And this becomes important in some cases. One of the stories I like to tell is the time I was doing a music title for a kid's game where a monkey was the main character. And so I was in my house, half naked, jumping around the furniture, making ooh-ah noises, trying to come up with a melody, and my girlfriend walks in. "No, really, honey, I'm working." So, how do you guys feel about being corporate or creative in the corporate or indie environment?
All right. This one's interesting. I'm not very shy about most things, so at my first job at Sierra, there was an office door that might as well have been paper, and I wrote a lot of music in that room, and the people just got used to it. So inhibitions, the only inhibition I really have is about like if I'm doing, singing something, and that I like my privacy for. But I can be creative in a public place pretty much. So, but if I'm not bugging people, that's a bonus.
Yeah, I mean, like, I guess the obvious answer is that, when you're in-house, you're being asked to be creative from the hours of 9 to 5.
Exactly.
Yes.
Can you really guarantee that that's when you'll have your melody? Can you really guarantee that most of my ideas come really, really late at night. I'm basically nocturnal. And my creative process involves coming up with some blue sky idea at night, jotting it down in whatever way possible, sleeping on it, and then in the morning worrying about things like, is it good? How do I like finesse it? All the details and all that kind of thing. That was very difficult to do. When not only are you in here from set core hours or whatever, but also you're constantly going to be interrupted by meetings and by maybe your friends come by for like whatever reason. I guess because we have offices and they like to just shut themselves out from the rest of the team or whatever. And you're constantly being basically assaulted by just all these other details that have nothing to do with your creative work. Whereas if you are a freelancer, you can kind of set a creative space. It's a little easier to pull that off. Mm-hmm. So for me, that's sort of how it's gone, and why I'll just get this out of the way. I do prefer the freelance world, and I guess we'll kind of keep coming back to that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to speak to that too. One of the things for me is a lot of times I get hired for sort of specialized things. That I mainly work as a sound designer, and I find like being out of house, being indie, I guess half my career has about been indie and half in corporate right at this point or in-house. I find I can focus more on specific things because of kind of what Wilbert was saying, where you're less interrupted with meetings and you're not, oftentimes I'm not implementing either, which is good and bad, but it kind of takes that focus just to the creation side. Like for instance, I worked on Lawbreakers doing Foley and sound design for that game for about 8 months. And to just focus on the Foley and sound design for the cutscenes and not have to worry about other stuff, I think that helped the creative process a lot.
I'm just going to underline focus again. It's like the biggest deal, right? As a freelancer, yeah, sure, maybe I can dive into a technical system and really, craft this elaborate Fabergé egg inside of some middleware integration with the game. But that comes at the detriment of when you're in-house creating that same system. You may not have the same focus, but you have greater resources to maybe push the creativity of it in a different direction. Instead of the insular system that you create abstracted from the team outside the fence, you have the resources of the team in real time that you can push forward the creativity deeper in that direction.
Well, and that's actually a good point. From the advantage of working in a corporate environment is you have the ability to, from a creative point of view, bounce ideas off of people, particularly people you know and trust and who are involved in the game or the product in a similar manner that you are. That can be an advantage. Whereas if you're just by yourself in your studio all day, which tends to happen on a regular basis, sometimes you don't know if what you're doing is good or not. You don't really have anything to bounce it off of until you then send it out, and then maybe you hear something back, maybe you don't.
Yeah, and that's true. That, like, for instance, making stuff, in both cases for me, I have to consciously make these barriers that you were talking about. It's like, okay, even when freelance, I still need to put like, okay, from these hours to this hours, I'm not going to look at Facebook, I'm not going to do this. You have to, there's more discipline involved, and it can be at midnight or whatever, but there's still the discipline of, yes, I'm going to start at 10 and go. But I also have to do that at work. It's harder, but I used to have this little door sign I'd put on my thing that says, do not disturb, so I would have these hours at work, and you have to have that. That's the only way I could do anything at work.
Did they respect the do not disturb?
I was just going to ask. How
Well, no, they didn't, but Becky made sure they did. Becky would be like, he's a kid, so my awesome colleague. So it ended up being respected. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it worked.
Well, they respected Becky.
Yes. Yes.
And I remember your office at Microsoft, though, was like a glass booth.
Oh, that was horrible. I didn't get any, but that was a different job. I wasn't doing creation in that office ever.
Right, right.
Yeah.
I had a glass booth where I did do creation at Danger, and the first thing I did was I put up Orlex foam across the window so people couldn't see what was happening.
Right.
And this actually became a little bit of an issue in the office because people want, what's he doing in there? What's going on there? It became both more of a mystique, but also a little bit standoffish. Oh, he's got his thing, and you know he's that guy. Or as I usually call it, the padded cell with a lock on the inside.
Right.
You know,
And also one other thing too is that I almost always get my best ideas when I'm walking my dog. Right? It's like I'm out there, I'm in the thing, I'm not thinking about the work, and then I'll look at the trees and I'm work up a sweat, and then some idea will come to me. I'm like, oh, that's a good idea, and then I'll go home and I'll work on that.
Yeah, on the subject of inspiration, one angle that I'm not sure has been touched on, but sometimes you can get inspiration from sources outside of audio. And if you can make friends with people on the art team, some of the best, quote-unquote, best ideas that I've had haven't come from audio people at all, but from designers and artists and concept folks, and making friends with them, which I know is not the easiest thing in the world to do, because usually it's like Audio Island out there, where it's like we're sequestered into our little corners. But if you can make those connections, they have brilliant insights, and they can offer a perspective that's sort of zoomed out. We're so focused on our details, and if you're in certain kinds of games like a cinematic title, then it's very easy to fall into the trap of thinking, oh, it has to be so serious, it has to be so dramatic, whatever. And you forget that we're just making a game to sell to people for money. And so it's good to just kind of interact with folks who are outside of that particular rat race and understand that you can take inspiration from other sources.
The power of a liberal education.
Well, and that's but beyond that too, it's also a corporate setting does allow for that direct collaboration, creative collaboration. Like I was freelance for a while in the early 2000s, and it was really hard to get adaptive scores done at that point in time, because support was challenging, and there weren't the technical resources in order to do it, not communication resources. So I purposely went back in-house so I could affect change from within, because there's certain creative changes I couldn't do as a freelancer that I wanted to do, both at Microsoft and PopCap, for example. Now, between middleware and communication tools and culture changes, it's actually doable now. I'm on a project where I'm checking in banks to Perforce, and we're communicating on Slack, and it's great. It's like the best of both worlds in a way. I still have to reach out for personal communication, but it's really nice now.
Which is a great segue to our next topic, work. How does being a member of a team, rather than a hired gun, help or hinder your workflow when producing game audio? So, like what Guy was saying, if you're in-house and you're a member of the team, and it seems to be a lot easier at times to be able to check things in and try it out and play things for people and listen, see how they react, and and also all the other stuff, the meetings and the reports and all the things you have to, emails, et cetera, and political battles you have to fight. That can be a lot easier when you're in-house as a member of a team. At the same time, when you're just a hired gun, it used to be, like you say, nowadays it's getting a lot better, because you can do a lot of the stuff you used to have to only be able to do in-house. Like if you used to work at Sony, you had to use Scream and that was it.
Right.
And if you were outside, you couldn't use it. It was just not available. But things have certainly gotten better now. But in the bad old days, where as a contractor you make sound, you toss it over the wall, and that's it. A couple of days later, maybe you get a build and you can see if it got implemented correctly or not, or if it still sounds the way you think it should. So there are advantages and disadvantages of that too, just for the workflow of how you produce the game.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have a comment on that. Actually, not too long ago, working with Blizzard as a contractor, and since they wouldn't let us run any part of the game remotely, it was difficult, and also the audio lead had to go on a recording trip for a couple weeks, but we couldn't stop working, and I asked the audio producer, maybe we should take a hiatus, because we're going to be, there were 5 of us making sounds, we're going to be sending a lot of sounds in that time. He's like, oh, no, it's fine, we're going to have somebody else, listen to them instead, and he's got approved to do that, make those decisions. And of course, sure enough, he listened to everything, green lighted a bunch of it, said it was good, got some fixes on some things, but mostly it was good. Then the lead comes back, and of course, like he had a totally different opinion on all these sounds, and I'm just like, oh my God, we're so behind. So that was definitely a challenge, being a contractor in that way, where we couldn't put anything in and test it and kind of make our own decisions. I think we would have been better if we could have put our sounds in while the lead was away, but since we couldn't, it was it was tricky.
Now, Damian, you're like the pipeline guy.
Yeah, I guess I was going to propose, is there any hindrance to being in-house when it comes to workflow and tools?
Oh, I see.
Is there a negative to it? Because I think the greatest negative or the greatest impact to a workflow and tools pipeline is actually being out of house. Whereas if you're in-house, you have all the toys. So it doesn't really, being in-house doesn't affect your workflow and tools in that you have them.
Except for, go ahead.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, and this is probably what you're about to say, but like in terms of things that are connecting to the game, absolutely. The tools are right there. If you have a problem, IT is right there, and all the other people who maybe made the tool are right there in the building.
Yeah.
But I suppose one aspect that you might not have as much control over is your own software. I mean, you might join a studio where we are a Pro Tools studio and that's it, or we are a Logic studio and that's what you get. Whereas if you're at home, you have the flexibility of picking whatever DAW you want, whatever sample libraries, and from that production end, you have a little more freedom.
And also when you want to do, I don't know, it's interesting because like if there's some kind of tool or pipeline process that you want to do, it's somehow, if I'm just independent, I'm just doing it this way, done. Whereas when I'm in-house, I have to, not only do the job, but sell the job to the people I'm doing it for, and then once the job is done, explain to them how it was done that way. And there's a whole process for getting your work approved.
Yeah, there's the overhead you're dealing with.
There's a lot of overhead.
Well, the other thing that when Caron was talking about working with Blizzard, that was, in a lot of cases, they're not alone. It's still majority, particularly larger companies. There's a cultural resistance to working and allowing access to builds, and that's understandable. A lot of them get released inappropriately, even with VPN and stuff like that. So you find middle and smaller companies more willing to open up their pipelines, which makes you closer to the team as an independent and able to do a lot of this stuff.
There's the other side of that as well, because right now I am doing a WISE implementation. I do not have access, there's no VPN, I don't do Perforce, we're using Git, so it's open. There's a lot of, there are I can't file bugs. I got to tell the guy, hey, this is not working,
Right.
blah, blah. No Jira, et cetera.
It's just where we are right now, but there could be. In other words,
It could be, and it has been in the past, but in this particular case, I'm not allowed to do that, and that's a little bit of a hindrance.
Yes,
Of
absolutely.
being indie as opposed to being in the team.
It seems like it's up to the game developers, really.
Yes,
I mean, it
that's
varies
it.
so wildly across studios. Some of them are very open to, I mean, when I was working on Lara Croft, they literally just gave me a PC and I could just implement however, all willy-nilly. I could play a level, decide that I'm not smart enough to fix this puzzle, and then just implement a new music cue for people like me who take forever to solve it. And I could just do that, and then it's
That's
in the
cool.
game, and there we go. But then there's other cases where sometimes for secrecy reasons, sometimes for technical reasons, I just don't have any access to the game at all. I never played Star Wars: The Old Republic, ever. I've never played the game, despite writing
Well, you
the
did music
score.
for it.
Yeah, but because there was just no way to send it out to us, and so we just had to go off of concept art and some lore documents, and that's it. So it's just wildly varies. But I mean, to Damian's point, being in-house means that you probably have the best situation in terms of workflow overall.
now, don't you guys all think that it's improved over the last, even 5 years, right?
Oh, yeah.
Definitely.
For the first 7 years of my career, I was a freelancer working specifically between content and the game as a technical sound designer, right? So I lived in middleware tools, whether they were off the shelf or proprietary. This was my jam, right? And I did it remotely as a preference, and I was able to be very effective when given the resources that I needed, like access to the build, access to the tools, access to a development platform. These were things that I could absolutely do. Now, that became very interesting for me after a time, because while I did feel very effective and very able to, from the remote perspective, do my job, it became increasingly more important to a developer towards the end of their production to actually have me physically on site. And so I then ended up spending, months at a time servicing a developer on site to be closer to the tools, to be closer to the team, and to be closer to the changes that were rapidly emerging towards finaling a game. And so you had this like almost race to the finish line where, sure, working remotely I was highly effective and highly capable and highly enabled for a period of time, but in the rapid acceleration towards finishing the game, that just wasn't enough.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to the next topic. Another easy one: money. Strategies for maintaining studio gear on an indie rather than a corporate budget. Now, one of the things I mean by this one is, and I was talking about this earlier, not here, but with some folks, is this idea that whenever I start a new project, I always or even when I'm building a studio for whatever purpose, I always build a studio for the purpose of the project I'm working on. So, and even when I start a new project, if I don't have to build a whole new studio around it, then I always buy a new toy or a new plug-in or a new synthesizer or something, just so I can have some fun playing with these things, and I hope that kind of fun translates into the work. But it's always geared toward, the gear is geared towards a specific purpose, a specific project that I'm doing. So right now I'm doing a mobile game. My Pro Tools rig, Florida killed it, and so I had to build a new system when I got back to California. And so for that, I'm doing a mobile game. I have no need for a surround system. I got no need for subwoofers. I got nothing. So I don't have them. I got two really big, nice Genelecs, but that's all I really need for a mobile game. Whereas if someone wanted to hire me to do work on a surround sound system, then I'd go and buy a surround mixer and a bunch more speakers. Whereas when I'm building a studio in a corporate environment, you kind of want to think about all the possible things you might want to do in a corporate setting and then build for that. So like at Magic Leap, I built a system, and again, the Magic Leap device, you wear it on your head, there's no surround system, there's no subwoofer, so I just had a couple of big Genelecs, and that was great for what I was using it for. Whereas in other situations, like at Danger, there was a bunch of different things that I had to do with it, and so we had a bunch of different systems, and I had like 4 or 5 computers in a row in my office in those days for doing specific things for different parts of the product as it was being made. So how do you guys feel about building your own studio versus building your studio on a corporate budget? You don't actually have a studio.
His guitar pedals.
Not to sort of self-advertise or whatever, but in 2016 I did a GDC talk about, I think it was just called like AAA virtual orchestration on an indie budget, and I went over a bunch of different strategies for basically how to stretch a small amount of dollars as far as humanly possible. Things like how to work with like live soloists in most effective ways and so on and so forth. But along with that, one recommendation I can give, especially towards people who are doing more kind of dramatic music or orchestral music or whatever, is only buy sample libraries that are basically the best. If there's a decision between like, oh, there's this library and I really love it and its sound is going to work so well for whatever I'm working on, but then there's this one that's cheaper, don't get the cheap one. Just wait until you can afford that. First off, sample library prices often come down, unless it's Spectrasonics, but that's another conversation. They often come down, and so if you can just hold off a little bit and only buy the ones that really fit for your, what you have in mind for what you're doing, you'll save money in the long run.
Fewer but awesome.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Fewer but awesome.
Absolutely, absolutely.
That's true of all gear, actually.
It's true.
We all go these phases of gear, right? No matter what we're doing, because gear evolves right along with us, the technology. So I'm in the that phase. And my motto is fewer, more awesome pieces of gear. You know, my studio is actually kind of doing this in some ways and doing this in others. My home studio has always been more capable than the corporate studio I've ever worked in, you know, except for like the studio, not my office, like at Microsoft or something. And that's the exception. But my home rig has always had more samples, and I've often done work at home for work at the corporate side. But as an indie, it's an actual direct investment in what you're doing. It's tax write-off. It's all of that. So, yeah, it's harder, but I think I invest more while I'm an indie for sure.
You invest more as an
Oh,
indie.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Interesting.
I want to underline tax write-off.
Well, there's
Yeah.
that as well.
And while I'm not a tax attorney by any stretch, I think we all know that there are opportunities to maximize equipment for self-employed purchases.
Well, and I'll even go farther than that, in that
Space.
the only way I've been able to afford the studios that I have had when I've had a corporate gig is by running the studio. You know, so it's like I have a corporate gig, I'm making a bunch of money, and the government takes like that much. But then as a side project, I'll do like a little project, and then I'll spend a bunch of money on gear. And then that amount of money comes off of my corporate taxes, and so I get more of it back than I would have otherwise. That way, the government is actually paying for my gear on a regular basis over time, and that's worked for me rather well. Now, it's different when your income is only indie. You have to do other tricks. That one doesn't quite work. And I'm not sure, I've been doing that for a long time, but there's years when I'm indie and there's years when I'm doing the corporate, running the thing off. I don't know if I were to do that every year for like 20 years in a row, the IRS might come after my ass. But
Yeah, your business has to make money, actually, after a certain number.
after a certain amount, you have to make money. And usually by that time I'm indie again anyway, so the only income I've got is from the
Right.
studio. Anyway.
But, yeah, the studio investment's one part of this whole money thing. Obviously, it's the investment piece. But Karen and I were talking yesterday about the extra costs of being independent. And I don't know, we're all independent now, and I just had to buy insurance for my whole family, health insurance. And that was an eye-opener. I hesitate to say the price tag, but it's wild for a family of three. What health insurance is, and it's not as good as health insurance as I had at Microsoft by a long shot.
At least
So-
in the US.
In the U.S.,
Yeah.
exactly, in the U.S., and
Well,
that's
anyplace else, it's part of your.
so it's it's a weight on the independent community that is actually very real. I think it's gonna be real for all Americans at some point. But I know for a fact that weighs on people's decisions whether to go indie or not, in a negative sense.
Right. No, absolutely.
You know.
It is certainly more expensive to be indie, but it also can be more rewarding. And a lot
Absolutely.
of times,
Absolutely.
you know, I was thinking about starting off this session with the line, is indie just another word for unemployed? Because certainly in my case, you know, there have been times when I've been working anything and then I got reorged out, or it was just time to go. And it's like, it wasn't like I had anything to go to, so, well, I guess I'm back to being indie again, you know. So it's interesting that way.
I was just going to add one thing. One of the strategies I employ, since so much of my income does go to medical insurance, is, you know, I will see what I need for that particular project and then buy accordingly a lot of times, like, and then of course use that for tax write-offs as well. And then look at where I'm at in the middle of the year, like August, like, do I have to spend more money? And if I do, I buy more equipment. And then again in like November, December, especially Black Friday, all the
Right.
plug-in sales,
That's
like,
right.
what can I buy at half off or whatever? And so I do that, and that helps. Or you know, you can also share with other, you know, indies sometimes, like Sound Library. Well, we're not supposed to do it, but everybody does it. You know, trade sounds and, like, you know, maybe borrow a microphone instead of buying it if you're not going to use it a lot, and that kind of stuff helps too.
Cool. Next big topic, power. Advantages and disadvantages of being an employee or a contractor when managing office politics. Now, we all know that politics and selling your job and telling people what you're doing and convincing them to buy in on it is at least 50% of the job, if not more. A lot of times I say, doing the job is only half of it. It's like everything else is part of it, even when you're an employee or a contractor. But if you're a contractor, you tend to be able to sidestep a lot of stuff. You also don't have to go to so many meetings. And even when you do go to meetings, a lot of times you're on a Google video chat, and so you can kind of put that there, and you can just mute your device, and you can go do what your other stuff, and continue doing stuff. But if you're in the room, you have to be part of the thing, even when you don't agree with what's happening or whatever. It can be a little more. The politics become more important, I think, when you're in-house and when you're an employee, or when you're a contractor. Agree, disagree?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to make sure that you're as close as possible to whoever your representative is. Maybe it's the audio director, maybe it's a music supervisor, but try to be not only close professionally, but in, almost like a personal level, so that they're really fighting for you. Because it is a struggle. Everyone has their opinions, especially with something like music. One example, actually, I was the composer and music supervisor for a game called Star Wars First Assault. And for that one, we budgeted, it was a 75-minute score. And I looked at the game and I realized this is multiplayer only. And we want it to have a feel and a vibe and a story to it, but there's no single player. So I basically said, all right, well, 15 minutes of the music will be just main themes, just things for the opening menu, and just a whole playlist of that. I don't think I ever would have gotten away with that if I were out of house.
Right.
But number one, it was me making the decision, so I could do almost whatever the hell I want. But also, it was easy to just put it in the game before it's live recorded with before it cost anyone anything. Put it in, show people where my mind was at, and get their buy-in on it.
You've done that a bunch. Actually.
Well, no, that's one of the again, another huge advantage, and why I have gone in-house, so that I could get, I mentioned earlier, leverage, right? You say the word power, but it's more about that leverage and being that advocate inside the corporation. That has to exist no matter whether you're out or in, and if you're a freelancer, you know the person who has that leverage, right? You're working with an audio director, hopefully, who has, as an independent, who has that upstream know-how of the corporate environment and can get the buy-in for audio. I got good at that, and that was to my advantage, and I was able to, allow creative people, including myself, to do creative things. So that's its own thing, and you can only do that really from within, so to the nth degree at least.
Well, and what you get when you sign up for that in-house is a myriad of things that mean nothing to someone outside the fence. So you don't have an investment in the company and their success or failure so much. You definitely have a commitment to the product and your contribution and its success, but you're not rounding up at the company meeting to hear financial reports about how the company's doing. And that's not woven into the fabric of every conversation with every coworker that you have about the morale or temperature necessarily on a daily basis, right? And so when you're outside the fence, you're like, rock, I can do this all, and you don't have to deflect the political business that goes on in-house.
With good cover, good leadership in the in-house, the freelance folks can really be streamlined and efficient, and that's key to a good pipeline.
And I don't want to embarrass you, but I lived in awe of Guy when I was working at Microsoft, because he got shit done. And I personally in my own group, I couldn't get anything done. I couldn't get anybody to listen to the damn word I was saying. It was very frustrating. But, and you started an initiative about plug-in initiative.
Yeah, DSPs, yeah.
Yeah, and she got it done. It was in the buy, and boom, boom, boom. I'm like, how did you do that? Oh my God.
And let me add one more thing. Guy, as a manager, deflected political bullshit for the team that wasn't important. And so he was the shit shield that basically deflected things that were really not a concern on a daily basis, right? He was a good filter, but also, a transparent communicator of things that would have an effect.
Right. That person, whoever it is, has to have the best creative goals of the game and the company in mind, and that's the key role of any audio director, particularly at a sizable developer or publisher.
You know, one thing you were talking about, though, about dealing with different audio people, you know, for me, a lot of times I've been the only audio guy there. The people I'm dealing with are managers and engineers and other people who don't really understand audio at all. And the political battle tends to be, believe me, I know what I'm talking about, and trying to sell the idea of, yes, this is the way we want to do it, even if it's at odds with, well, that means the engineer has to do a bunch of stuff, and it's not my schedule, I don't have time for it, blah, blah, blah. And dealing with those kinds of political issues, again, it's doable in-house. As a contractor, you can't reassign the engineers, here, you need to do this for me, and it's going to take you a week, and, you know, as a contractor, you can't do that. But as in-house, you can go to that guy's manager, you can go to your manager, you can go to his manager, et cetera, to get things done.
You know, Caron, you and I were also talking about the different shades of corporate. This is kind of where this comes in, where I'm hoping that more and more, as an independence, we can do more of that, you know, have more of this creative state. As teams become more pickup ball games to get a game done, it looks a little more like, hate to say it, but more of like how a movie gets done. And there might be more of that. And in that case, there might be less bifurcation between corporate but the indie might be able to have more input in technical says, for example.
Right, like a virtual audio department as
Yeah.
it builds with smaller teams, multiple contractors working together with like a developer possibly.
The more they let us
Yeah.
into their code base to do stuff in Unreal and Unity at that level and script in there, we're working by the week or by the day or by the hour. And that's a different
Right.
ball game.
Yeah, I think the model of, you know, the contractors out of house and, well, they're, you know, not here and we don't need to tell them that, it's starting to go away, thank goodness.
Right.
Because so many times I've had to fight to find things out that I'm like, well, what? We don't have the latest animations? Like, you know what? This changed a week ago, we didn't get them? Like,
Yes.
I'm often the one that's doing the tracking for the client, I find, and I'm just
Exactly.
like, what? I shouldn't be doing this, but I do it because I'm protecting myself and the deadlines and my deliveries, and I want them to be happy.
But those are services now we can offer.
That is true.
So we should turn that around.
Right,
And as independents and say, well, there's a, you know, we have a little fee for that.
Yes,
You know?
producer.
Yeah, I got a producer. So,
Cool, okay. Final topic, #game audio. Ways you can contribute to the game audio community as an employee and as a contractor. Now, Damian here is the game audio community in some ways, and the #game audio or #game audio GDC is a way that we can communicate about issues in the industry and what's going on. How does being in-house or a contractor help or hinder that process? Because you've been both.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it ultimately comes down to that little disclaimer that people put into their profiles that says something to the effect that these are my personal views and do not represent those of my employer. When you are your own employer, you don't need that disclaimer, right? Otherwise, you have a heightened awareness of what is appropriate for you to share, and there's just a little more focus on that. So that's the first thing I can think of.
I think there is a difference on some levels. Not in terms of participation. In fact, there's strengths and weaknesses. But that for certain, when you're with a corporation, whether they're, and every place I've been has been very open about letting me speak, letting me blog, even in creative projects, but you're still wearing that hat when you come out. So when I was at Microsoft, I'm a little bit cautious about behavior and things I say, just because, you know, I'm representing a large corporation. And now I can go, yay, and do anything. But the advantage, though, is you represent a big corporation and you can actually push initiatives and carry a little bit of sway with certain things. So there's good on both sides.
I'm going to tell one, I hope I don't embarrass you, Guy Whitmore story, where when I was independent, and I used to write this thing called the Annoying Audio Blog, which was a series of articles designed to be kind of as outrageous as possible about audio topics. And I had gone to a conference and listened to a bunch of the new games route, and I wrote this rant about why is it that we have these humongous machines with hundreds of tracks and all the games still sound like 1950s gladiator music and the same Sturm und Drang and full choir I've always heard. And I published this, and it caused a little bit of a stir. And at one point, I think actually barbecue, guy took me aside and goes, "You know that thing you wrote? I'm glad you said that because I can't say that." When he was at Microsoft.
Yes. But I don't think being in-house or freelance, as far as community participation goes, right? Maybe in a soft environment, not necessarily the hard black and white of the online experience. I don't feel like having bounced across those barriers in the past years has really changed the way that I approach community from a grassroots level. And if anything, like you mentioned, there's a even greater responsibility and or power that comes from having a position in-house that you can maybe leverage towards, space or food budget or, connections with other studios, towards trying to bring community together. And so, at the same time, when you're freelance, wow, you might have more time to really pull together things and bring a more diverse experience to whatever community you're participating in. And so you have a little bit of a balance there between those.
Yeah, one thing that Damian and I were talking about kind of offline was that when you're freelance, there's certainly a lot of benefits to being very active in the greater game audio community. Whereas when you're in-house, you're collecting a check no matter what.
Right.
There's a danger of becoming comfortable.
Yes.
And
I'm glad you brought that up.
yeah, well, I mean, you guys can expand on this, but basically the idea is that, you have your job, you do your job well, you'll keep your job, hopefully, and, why not go home? And why go to the extra effort of throwing events and participating in the community? And it's valid, but my take on it is that you have more potential, in my opinion. You have a little bit more power. I wouldn't necessarily say responsibility because it's not for everyone, and I understand. But when you are connected to a company, there's more opportunities for you to give back, I think. And once again, I really have to highlight both PopCap and ArenaNet for opening their doors, and actually a bunch of different Seattle companies.
Been pretty good,
we have a series of lectures and meetups at the various studios, Bungie as well, 343 I think, where they've just invited anyone in the Seattle Game Audio group to just come and give a lecture and hang out, and there's often like food, and it's just been a wonderful community that has grown out of this because they didn't become too comfortable and just kind of 9 to 5 it.
Well, and if you're a freelancer, on the other side of it, you've got a super vested interest, right? Hey, if you put a flag on the moon for community in your town, all of a sudden, people know you. You're the person who is, putting it on the map for people to, get down and, share their experience or share their knowledge, or you're the person who is bringing them to a studio and allowing for an educational opportunity. And as a freelancer, wow, that kind of thing is great, right? And so you have a great opportunity there, maybe with the addition of the extra time you might have in between things, to really do something positive that has a mutually beneficial kind of plus to it.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I find that as a freelancer, it's essential to be more involved in different organizations, go to conferences, go to meetups, and I'm from LA, and there's just like always something going on. I could like spend my entire week going to different, VR events and conferences and stuff. I have to actually pick and choose because it can get a little overwhelming, but that's been very essential for me because I get most of my work from either people that know me or referrals or people I meet in person at different conferences and stuff. So it's been very important.
I'd like to, pick up on that and what you were saying about the complacency thing, because what I found as someone, if there's advice I would give to people kind of traversing this in and out thing, is treat your corporate job as if you were an indie needing to both grow both your skills and your people you're meeting. You don't have the for sale sign out, but you're active and you're not stagnating professionally either. You're actively seeking out the latest and greatest things. What happens in a corporate setting, you're often asked to focus on a specific thing, and it's easy just to tunnel vision in, whether it's management, whether it's a particular type of area in your sound design work. And it's, you got to remember, bring the head up and go look broader and keep it active.
Because if something comes along like a layoff, and you find yourself adrift in the world, if you'd been engaging with community, you might have your finger on the pulse of what's next.
Right.
Yeah, it's all about the people. That's my motto.
And on that note, that's a great ending for that one. That was the topics I have. And we'd like to take some questions from the audience. If anybody wants to ask about corporate and or indie or anything else at all, come up to the mic and state your purpose.
Hello. Thank you for that talk. I was a little late in the beginning. Got here late. Apologize for that. But if you haven't already discussed it, what are some, techniques in giving direction to sound designers who are providing you with sounds in the way that you want to implement them? Sometimes I have trouble with giving that direction, and then I get the sounds. I'm like, oh, it's not I want to create different random containers and stuff like that.
So the question is, if you're in-house, how do you deal with contractors giving you the sounds you want?
Sure, yeah.
I have to repeat that.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in on that real
Please.
quick, because my thought was I'm the one trying to change the culture from within to make the people I work with out of house to be more part of the team. So for instance, allowing source control if possible, or at least being able to create a wise work unit so that the work is more fully integrated as it comes in. That's just one of my personal preferences. And then you know what you're getting. They're hearing, the intention is already more interlocked.
Yeah, on that note, I would say, sure, templatize that stuff for folks outside the house even. Let me hand you a work unit or a FEV, and, this is the format, shovel your content into these buckets and then redeliver the whole kit and caboodle, right? But I think I might have heard something else in that question about communication of, creative.
Yeah, like how to deliver, what formats delivered. Do I want one-shots? Do I want loops? Is this animation going to be, do I want a bespoke animation, 3 second, or do I want 3 1 seconds to put in it, stuff like that.
Sure, communicating elemental systems components, right? And that's a tough one. I would say that the place I would start is establishing the vocabulary. You're going to come to a contractor with the idea, right? And you're going to have a language that would be easy for you to describe that. But I think there's a danger in just jumping to it without making sure that the words that you use mean the same as what they hear when you use those words. And so I guess it's establishing that vocabulary so that, and establishing it early, right? Whether that's a style guide kind of thing where you talk about, things that explain the aesthetic, or whether it's the technical side of it when you say one shot, or when you say surface only material sound, or what is an appropriate amount of silence at the end of a wave file, or attack, just again, simplify a vocabulary that you can agree on.
right?
And just one thing to add to that, naming conventions and having them be really well thought out are like a gift from God. I mean, you can be as anal as you want, and as a freelancer, I love that. Because it just makes sure that there's no confusion later on, and you can easily implement stuff in your game, and it just works. And I think that almost would solve a lot of these issues with vocabulary. Is it just me, or does every studio call cutscenes a different thing?
Yes.
There's vignettes, there's cutscenes, there's cinematics, and then there's in-game versus pre-rendered. I mean, it's mind-boggling.
Ooh, my favorite? Polygonal cutscenes. Or polycuts.
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 Haven't heard of that.
Polly wants a cracker.
Wow.
Yeah, I was gonna say, a lot of times, projects I work on, sometimes it's as primitive as Google Docs, but that helps just to have everything mapped out in a spreadsheet with what, like, the naming convention is, and if it's looping or not looping, and like the categories of all the sounds and the material types and everything, like, because then if there's any question and your contractors are working and it's 2 a.m, they can keep going, and they don't, it's good to have stuff written down.
That's so much work, though.
Yeah, but.
Time for all. But thank
And then
you,
they
yeah.
can track, also if they sent the sound or what, the feedback and all of that, if they're waiting for feedback, and it gets, maybe not in the same document, but.
And I feel like the level of aptitude should be really high right now out there with people that are working outside the fence, right? So that if you do create a prototype system in a middleware tool that's extensible, you should be able to hand that to them. They should be able to read the tea leaves of it and understand kind of at a glance what you're doing. So I feel like that is a ecstasy of communication if you can just give them that implementation.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for being here and sharing your collective wisdom. So in a corporate job, it seems like you have a lot of extrinsic motivation to keep doing your job, because or else people will be mad at you and whatnot. And same thing if you're actively working on a project when you're indie. But I'm curious to hear about how you go about keeping yourself motivated to keep hustling when maybe it's sort of a dry spell and there aren't as many projects going on, but you need to keep working and doing your thing anyways. Just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Motivation from a corporate and an indie point of view. Sure.
I think it's every good manager's obligation to make sure that the workforce, the people working for them, have something that they're doing at all times, not just downtimes, that is inspiring to them. I have the one thing rule. Sometimes it's a project called the one thing rule, that everybody who was working for me had something that they were like into. And whether it was something directly related to a project we were working on, and usually that was the case, it's like, I want to do this for this project. Great, that helps us, and you get to do the one thing or two things, right? So you're always doing something that's keeping you in a growth mindset. That's the other side. Make sure they're always doing something where they're learning something, and learning something that they want to learn, even if it's not directly related to their project.
Right, and as an indie, same deal, even more so. So like, there have been times when I've been working on a project, and it's a bunch of work for Google, and then there was like this lull before, I wasn't sure what the next thing was going to be, but there was this lull. And so instead of trying to generate work, I just started doing things that I wanted to do. I started getting more into programming. I built a little game that demonstrated this interactive audio idea that I hadn't seen anyplace else, and I just wanted to demonstrate it so I could show it to people. And that wasn't generating any money for me, but it was certainly flexing my programming skills, showing that I knew what was happening in the interactive audio world, showing that I was innovative and had some creativity involved, and those apps that I then published helped me get the next gig. And so, it's not, particularly when you're freelance, there is no downtime. If you're not always working all the time, you should be.
Right, it's a good time to do some marketing too, like go do lunch meetings and more conferences and more meetups and things like that if you have a downtime, because that also will help. I know for me, I get a kind of isolated working mostly now from my home studio, so it's really like a big boost to my creativity and motivation to go and meet people and talk about what's happening with what they're working on and just kind of get plugged in again.
kind of like what's happening right now. I told my clients I am unavailable this week. I am doing this. And yeah.
And I think marketing extends to not only, let's say phone calls, emails, and meetups, but also blog posts,
Websites.
tutorial videos, rocking your resume, there's a whole slew of marketing that I would maybe consider soft marketing, where it's more like, trying to establish you and your discipline or your company as someone who knows something, I guess.
Yeah.
And that kind of marketing can go a long way towards, eventuality of a gig at some point.
Yeah, so just two quick things. One, I would say keep a diary of side projects that you want to do, but you have absolutely no time to do so. I love Trello. I have it on my phone and my computer and everything, and whenever I have any idea of I would love to do this, but I don't have time, just do that. You will never go dry because you'll always have something to do. And secondly, and this is very specific, I don't know if you had a chance to see this, but Anton Voltek from Gorilla had a wonderful talk about where he basically outlined 3 different stages of development. And I know the generic industry definition is, you're in crunch mode and you're in whatever, but he called them waves. And there's different, basically he would say, okay, well, you'll be before the wave, which is when things are not so busy. And he had a great list of things that you can do. I think they're applied both to freelance and corporate. Things you can do when you're not so busy, but that'll help you when you're in the wave and you're so busy that you're just, okay, it's time to just work on this and not worry too much about process because there's no time to deal with that. And then after the wave, where it's basically boils down to analyzing how you were working during crunch mode or the wave, whatever you want to call it, and trying to fix things that maybe went wrong or workflow issues or whatever it ends up being. I would definitely check that out in the vault whenever it goes up.
Yeah, exactly. It's very prescient here. And the last thing I'll just add to that is that if you're in-house, like maybe you're in production, you don't have time to experiment with things, but you're going to be in that wave situation. And I would say that probably the thing that one should always return to in those times of question over what is next or what should be done is advocacy. Like reaching out to other disciplines and departments in-house and firming up relationships or creating new relationships that can then continue to carry you through that production process.
We're about to run out of time. Last question.
Thanks. Thoroughly enjoyed this, and I agree about Anton's talk. That was really great. I want to revisit it, even though I've got it memorized and repeating in my head. My question is, I came from corporate, I've gone freelance, and I'm now sort of considering going back in-house. And I've come to really love my work-life balance and the freedom that I'm able to create. Because as creatives, it's sort of, you have your specific zones during the day where you find I am in it, and it's like those are you make those your untouchables, and you get so much done. I guess my question is related to some of the topics you brought up in terms of politics and then maintaining that work-life balance, because that's, I guess, a fear of mine is going in-house and losing a bit of that. So what would be your advice to question and inquire about both the current manager's ability to deflect politics as well as the ability to manage your work-life balance and not be sort of slaved to that crunch or burnout?
So the question being work-life balance from a corporate point of view. I'm a little bit off the beaten path in that I don't believe there is such a thing. I think work is life is work, and it's all the same stuff to me. I don't have a wife and kids or other stuff I do on the side, so basically if I'm not working, I'm not living. And in a corporate situation, even then, I always try to do, I work from this time to this time, and that's when I'm in this mode, I'm in that, and then afterwards, I'm doing something else, just even kind of to let my brain decompress from what was happening during that time. I tend to try and do that even when I'm freelance, so that the definition of work, and you know, so I'm working now, this is my work time. And then everything else I do is life, but some of it is even kind of, I'm not working so that I can go back to work better, kind of thing. So that's just me. I'm not.
It's
Yeah.
interesting that you kind of are more wary of the corporate workplace for work-life balance, and I think a lot of indie people would argue that that's a more dangerous place for work-life balance, right?
Well, in corporate, you don't really have a choice necessarily. I mean, it's just, it kind of is what it is.
Well,
you can do your best, but at a certain point, it might be a situation where if you just find that a studio is being kind of toxic, where it's,
Yeah.
you know, making people stay till midnight or whatever, then maybe it's time to leave.
Yeah.
I would say you do have a choice
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah.
Remember, you're interviewing the corporation as well as they're interviewing you, and you have to kind of become aware of what that culture is known for and what it's like. And there's ways to find out.
That's exactly what I'm asking for, is sort of what's the best ways to kind of find
To talk
that
to
out.
other people who work there.
Yeah.
And then actually, and you don't have to do this during an interview, it's kind of awkward, but you do your own intel from colleagues, but then after you get a job, then say, well, what is this like before I decide? Now it's my turn to say, what can I make this? You know?
Right.
I'll share an in-house experience just very briefly, because ArenaNet is very public about their work-life balance. And so this was something that they were very forthcoming about, and definitely something I'm concerned about as someone who's in-house. And again, I think when you find a company who is willing to say, yeah, work-life balance, we get it, right? I think you've found a mature company that's willing to accept responsibility for that, and what that means for a schedule and for a culture. So I would say demand it.
We are out of time. Thank you all so much. I want to thank my panelists. This has been great. GDC!